All right, guys, as requested, 2 lectures on religion, but used as a way of introducing this last important concept within evolutionary psychology, which is cultural group selection. So before you listen to this lecture, you should go and listen to the podcast I did with Hidden Brain. That provides a good introductory springboard to the thing we're going to be talking about in this lecture, but it does so aimed at a more general audience. For you guys, we can now go a little deeper, given that we've put in place a bunch of the important basic concepts of evolutionary psychology, which are going to be integrated and come into play in our attempt to understand religion as a natural phenomenon. So the story starts actually without any need for cultural evolution. It starts at the genetic level. The way the human mind is constructed leaves it very likely to produce the basic forms of spiritual thinking that eventually gave rise to the types of religions we see today. And you can see this from an evolutionary byproduct standpoint. We have certain adaptive psychological phenomena that give rise as a byproduct, almost inevitably, to some form of religious thinking. We're going to talk about 4 of these ideas right now, starting with this idea of intuitive mind-body dualism. So the idea there is that we are an incredibly social animal that requires us to understand the mental states of others. And because that's been such an important and relatively recent evolutionary adaptation, something that's particularly pronounced among human beings, the evidence suggests that we've evolved these 2 separate mental systems, one for understanding physical objects and the other for understanding social or mental objects. And we know this because if you look at the way children intuitively carve up the world, they seem to see these things separately. If you show them a ball that rolls across the screen, but then does something where it violates some sort of folk physics. Say it's rolling across here in a straight line and then disappears and all of a sudden it's rolling across here, they'll get spooked. But if you show the same thing with something that they perceive to be social, they don't apply the same folk physic rules to that. So they seem to be interpreting those as following different rules because they interpret it using different mental systems. Fine. That's an adaptation, right? That's important for us understanding mental states as something which follows different rules than things following physical states. But the consequence of that is that we intuitively, at baseline, our default understanding is that the mind and the body, the mental and the physical, are separate. Now, that of course conflicts with reality because sure, in some sort of epistemological sense, maybe mental states should be understood as differently from bodily state, but from the material standpoint, from what these things are made of, the mind is just what the brain does. The mind is the product of physical stuff, and as a result has to follow the same physical rules as everything else in the world. However, we don't intuitively think that. Intuitively, we think that the mind can exist without the physical substrate of the brain that produces it. And that's why it doesn't seem too far-fetched for us to think about things like switching minds, right? Like you can keep the same physical brain, but somehow you can switch the minds. You see this trope used in movies, when the 13-year-old and the 30-year-old, they switch the minds. People transfer their consciousnesses over, and most importantly, and perhaps most naturally, we think that the mental states can persist after the brain dies and decays away. So we think that personality, consciousness, can persist after physical life. And you can see how that forms the basis for the ideas of souls and afterlives, of the persistence of the mind after the body dies. Now, I think this idea of it being intuitively difficult to understand the physical nature of our mental states was put better than I've ever seen it before in the short story by Jean-Paul Sartre called The Wall. which is about these two prisoners. I think it's in the Spanish Civil War, and they're going to be put up against a wall and executed by firing squad. And the short story is a meditation on death, as the two characters, Pablo is the first person character, and he's talking to his fellow prisoner as their execution is approaching. And the other prisoner says to Pablo, he says, "I tell myself there will be nothing afterwards, but I don't understand what it means. Sometimes I almost can, and then it fades away and I start thinking about the pains again, bullets and explosions. I'm a materialist," by which he means not like I like consumer goods, but I believe in the material world, not the supernatural. "I'm a materialist. I swear it to you. I'm not going crazy, but something's the matter. I see my corpse. That's not hard, but I'm the one who sees it with my eyes. I've got to think that I won't see anything anymore, and that the world will go on for others. We aren't made to think like that, Pablo." To which Pablo says, "Shut up," I said. "Do you want me to call a priest?" Now, you can empathize with the perspective of the other prisoner there. It's hard for us to imagine non-existence. And the reason for that is because when you imagine your future, when you imagine any future, you're doing so by extrapolating from the mental states you've had so far. You're sort of running a simulation, an assumed simulation on what your brain has been so far into what your brain is going to be in the future. But because all we've known is existence, it's very, very hard for us to imagine non-existence. Because like the prisoner said, it's us doing the imagining. It's hard to imagine a future without us, but there will be one. So this is a good example of how this was not an adaptation. We didn't evolve to misunderstand this, but it's a consequence, a byproduct of the limitations of the human mind. And in this sense, that idea of a mind that can exist without a body is an evolutionary byproduct, but one that is fundamental to understanding certain central tenets of religion. All right, hyperactive agency detection device. So this is a woman from Florida who was eating a grilled cheese sandwich. She took one bite, as you can see, but then she stopped because in the sandwich she saw the visage of the Virgin Mary. I think it's the Virgin Mary, it might be Jesus. It's some religious figure. And as a result, she stopped. She preserved the sandwich. It's said that it gave her all sorts of luck, and eventually she sold it on eBay for something like $200,000. These things happen every so often. People will see the pattern of something religiously significant in an otherwise random object. Here's another example. This is a particular burn mark made by lightning in a tree, again looking like the Virgin Mary in this case, prompting pilgrimages to that. Now, this tendency for us to see patterns, especially patterns of agents in randomly occurring things, is called pareidolia. And it's the reason why we see things like faces in the clouds or faces in trees. This is maybe my favorite example, a dog experiencing pareidolia, one assumes. And the reason this is a phenomenon is because our brains are tuned, adaptively tuned, to over-detect agency in the world, to make errors on this side rather than the other side. Now, to explain that, we go back to our error management chart, the one that I keep bringing up, right? In this case, we're replacing a car being stolen and a car not being stolen with something perhaps more consequential. So you're walking in the forest and you hear a snap behind you, or you hear the rustling of leaves. There are only two possibilities in this case. One is that it could be a predator, and the other is that it is not a predator. And your reaction, again, you can only have two reactions in this case. Like the car alarm going off or not going off, you either engage a fear response, cortisol floods your body, your heart starts pounding, blood flows to your legs, and you get the hell out of there. Or you ignore it and you carry on. Now, in two of these situations, like always, the right thing has happened. You engaged a fear response when there is an actual predator and hopefully you escaped it, or you ignored it and there was no actual predator and you didn't waste any extra energy. But in two cases, there are errors. In one case, you've unnecessarily engaged the fear response, and in the other case, you have improperly ignored the actual threat of a predator. Now, it's pretty clear in this case what's the more costly of these two errors. In the one case, you just expend some extra energy, take some extra cortisol, freak out a little bit, but in the other, you get eaten. Now, because we're going to make mistakes in the situation, because we don't have a perfect signal detection device to always know when it's a predator and always know when it's not a predator, our brain is tuned itself to make the less costly error. Those who were tuned the other way got eaten and did not become our ancestors. So the result is that we readily saw and now still see agents where there are none. Our brain is tuned to make that error more often. Now, you can see how that gave rise to imagining supernatural agents where there actually weren't any. You pair that with the next concept, a promiscuous teleology. What does that mean? A lot of words. Well, just two, but they're big ones. Teleology we talked about before. Teleology is the idea of assuming that there are goal states behind something. We have a brain that is similarly tuned to overperceive goal states, to overperceive the idea that something is meant to cause something else. And the reason for that is because of the social learning mechanisms that we talked about last week. As creatures who are inclined to understand tools, are inclined to learn from others, we are tuned to pay specific attention to something causing something else. So this is why these children over-imitate. They think that every aspect that's happened was responsible for the thing that actually did happen. So that way you kind of imitate everything, and hopefully you achieve the same outcome as the person you're trying to imitate. The consequence of this overperception of teleology is that we see that same causal pattern. We assume there being a purpose behind events that actually don't have a goal state behind them, like natural events. And so in a world where we're surrounded by natural events occurring, tides coming in, tides going out, suns rising, suns going down, winds blowing, we attribute purpose, goals, and mental states behind those. Paired with this idea of hyperactive agency detection, it became very natural and again, almost inevitable for us to imagine these purposeful plotting agents behind things that were just natural events occurring. And so the original gods, the original spirits, the original supernatural agents that we saw in the world were these minds behind these types of natural events. They were sun gods and wind gods and ocean gods. And those, again, were the psychological raw materials from which the modern religions today have emerged. Now, there's one more of these that I want to talk about. The first three are all cognitive adaptations. They refer to why the way we think leads us to make these types of beliefs. The last one is actually a motivational state, whereas the other ones made certain supernatural ideas thinkable, easy to come to mind. This one is actually the product of our mind motivated to see the world in a certain way, reaching for seeing the world in a certain way. This idea was perhaps most famously articulated by Freud, who was no fan of religion, and he saw it as wish fulfillment. We have religious beliefs because we want to believe those things. A later disciple of Freud, Ernest Becker, neo-Freudian, who was writing in the 70s, actually at Simon Fraser University, he wrote this book, The Denial of Death. And in it, hugely depressing book, by the way. He was dying of cancer as he wrote it, and then published it 6 months after he died and won the Pulitzer Prize. And in it, he makes the argument that all of human culture, everything we've created, are attempts to wrestle with the reality of our mortality. They're attempts to actually deny that mortality, either literally by positing things like afterlives, or symbolically by trying to create a culture which will live on after us, achieving some sort of symbolic immortality, which makes death somewhat more palatable. Now, there is a body of research in social psychology which shows that when you do activate people's thinking about death, they seem to have all these psychological reactions, including defensive reactions, showing greater support for their own culture, for instance. The findings are consistent with Becker's idea that such cultural reaffirmations are tools we use to compensate for the fear we have of our own mortality. However, I'm not so sure that this body of research will survive the replication crisis. Some of it's pretty sketchy, so we'll see what happens with that. Nevertheless, the idea is very interesting, but I think it's incomplete. Humans fear more than just death. And this is something that we could expand to call chaos management. It's an idea that's been put forward by, among others, my undergrad mentor, Jordan Peterson, as well as my current colleague, Steve Heine. And their argument, they both made this independently, is that, well, the world is chaotic and unpredictable and unfair. Those are all terrifying aspects of the world that we've just been placed in and asked to live with. And so the mind is drawn towards, is motivated to impose some sort of order on that unpredictable, unfair chaos. It looks for ways to palliate that discomfort with the world as it is. And religion is suggested to be one of those ways. And so some interesting evidence for this is stuff done by, among others, another one of my colleagues, Kristen Lauren, in what they call the compensatory control model, that we require faith in the controllability of the world. And if you take away faith from one area, we find the need to compensate with imposed control from another area. And so they did a bunch of studies where you reduce, say, a personal feeling of control and people compensate by believing more in a controlling God. Or you reduce people's confidence in the secular institutions, the government, and now people, terrified of living in a world which is uncontrolled, again compensate with more belief in a controlling God. All right, so as mentioned, these types of psychological phenomena form the evolutionary bedrock from which our spiritual thinking initially grew, but on their own can't give us a full explanation for why religions look the way they do today. For that, we need to integrate the last concept of evolutionary psychology that we're going to be learning about in the course. And that's what we're going to pick up on in the next lecture.